And I'm always coming up with new ideas, thinking them through. And this morning, I'd like you to pretend that you don't know that I'm a Georgist. I'd like you to take these ideas that I'm coming up with from a more neutral perspective, let us say. I'm talking about the subject of how to tax the rich. Now, there's this overlap between taxing the rich and Georgism, but our general idea as Georgists has been we don't want to tax people just because they're rich. On the other hand, there's a lot of concern for inequality these days. And so I've been dealing with the question of how can we reduce inequality consistent with ideas about justice and without ruining the economy. So I want you to be prepared for some innovative ideas. And in thinking about taxing the rich, I found it necessary to categorize assets. Go a few more steps down. And one more. And that's the only slide that you'll see for the rest of the talk. I've been advised that it's better not to try to get people to read things that I'm also speaking. And so I'm just going to explain that slide for the rest of my talk. Now, another thing I should say is that there's a tradition in departments of economics all around the United States, and I think perhaps around the world, that when an economist gives a talk, we interrupt throughout. The last time I gave this talk, it was in Strasbourg at the Association of Public Economic Theory. And I didn't get any interruptions, and I was done in 15 minutes, and they had to be silent for the rest of my half-hour slot until the next person gave his talk. So I've added a bit of material, but it would be appropriate to interrupt whenever you like, and if we're running out of time, I'll speed things up.
You've come to the right place.
So let's talk about capital first. Capital comes from saving. What I have in mind here by capital is something that is unaffected by monopoly. So capital that's used in purely competitive activities. So a capital that's used in purely competitive activities will get the ordinary rate of return in neither more nor less. And any kind of recurring tax on capital is inefficient. A tax on the value of capital, a tax on the income of capital, tax on the value of capital reduces the incentive to accumulate capital, same a tax on the income from capital. You just get a less efficient economy with any kind of recurring tax on capital. But, well, there's some exceptions. One exception is if the capital generates a negative externality. Some people think that a tall building has the negative effect of casting shadows, blocking the sun from surrounding buildings. That's probably true in some cases. So if you had a tax on buildings that reflected the harm that is done by the shadows they cast, that would be an improvement in efficiency. But it should also be said that buildings can generate a lot of positive externalities, true, in terms of generating business for surrounding land. So it would be quite wrong-headed to insist on internalizing all the negative externalities of capital without also internalizing the positive externalities. But it does have to be said that if there are systematic negative externalities associated with some kind of capital, a tax that internalizes those negative externalities improves efficiency. Now, Another exception to the general rule that it's inefficient to tax capital occurs with respect to a one-time levy on capital, provided certain conditions are met. If it's not anticipated and never expected to occur again, then it has no efficiency effect. You could still question it in terms of justice, perhaps, but such a capital levy has been discussed from time to time in economics books. One example of a circumstance where it is regarded as plausibly appropriate would be after a war where, say, a third of the owners of capital have lost everything and two-thirds have lost nothing. You might take the two-thirds who lost nothing and say, come up with a third of what you lost, and we'll use that to compensate those who lost everything. You would expect it not to occur again. It couldn't have been anticipated, would not affect the incentive to accumulate capital, and would therefore be consistent with efficiency. Now, another possible use of a one-time levy on capital that would be efficient would be if you used it to rectify a past injustice. If there was a history of slavery and people took the profits from slavery and invested it in capital, and you say, well, we're going to take the capital that people have from their slavery profits and confiscate it from them and compensate the former slaves, that would not promote inefficiency in any way. It would be consistent with continued efficiency. Something happened with my, there it is. Another example that occurred to me this morning or last night was a tax to rectify an unjust debt. Now, I had to make this example a bit contorted, so bear with me. Suppose there is a tradition that says if you want to be a dentist, you have to compensate existing dentists for competing with them. People have had instances in mercantile situation where if you want to join a guild, you have to compensate for the competition you cause. So suppose that if you want to become a dentist, you have to buy $200,000 worth of equipment and then incur $100,000 debt to other dentists secured by that equipment. So that if you don't pay the $100,000 you owe the other dentists, they can take your equipment. So, and now suppose that this is a long-standing practice, and so there's such a thing as dental debt, and dental debt gets traded on markets, and you might have what you could, with a bit of imagination, called the innocent user or the innocent holder of dental debt.
Is that what the word indenture comes from?
Who knows? If you were to pass a law that such debts are inappropriate and will be canceled, that would in a sense be a tax on the debt ownership of the capital. But I would say that such a change would in no way be inefficient or not cause any inefficiency. So that would be another example of a tax on the debt ownership of capital that would not be efficient. Another example that occurred to me overnight has to do with horses.
Did you get any sleep?
Not much. Suppose the people who are concerned with the treatment of animals were to get greater support for the idea that we shouldn't mistreat animals and that a bit in a horse's mouth is unacceptable, is cruelty. The same for a mule or a donkey. And suppose that in response to this, rather than prohibit it, we pass a law placing a tax of $100,000 a year on the ownership of a bit that can go in the mouth of an animal. Example of that old maxim that the power to tax is the power to destroy. I think that if such a tax were to represent our new moral understanding, we could say that, well, if that causes people to not invest in riding stables anymore, that's a good thing. Now, there is another aspect of this that deserves consideration. That is that if we don't know for sure whether it's going to happen, and we decide at the end that a horse is just another piece of capital, and all these animal activists were wrong, then we could say that in the interim we had a lot of disincentive to invest in riding stables that was from the eventual moral perspective an inefficiency. So any uncertainty as to what the taxes are going to be is arguably inefficient. Although you might also say that from the perspective of those who think that animals shouldn't be subject to having bits in their mouths, that at least it was a step in the right direction. And if we eventually were all to agree, we would say, well, it was a beginning toward what we eventually realized we had to do in a fuller way. Now, let's see what there's one other way that capital might be taxed that would be arguably inefficient, though I don't like it. And that has to do with the pain of envy. The pain of envy. Suppose that when somebody saves and buys himself a lovely grand piano, somebody else says, gosh, I really don't like the fact that he has a grand piano and I don't. I know I frittered all my money away, but I still am unhappy because he has a grand piano. If a utilitarian were to say, well, we want to take account of all sources of pleasure and pain, so we have to charge a person who has the grand piano for the unhappiness he causes in the way of envy on the part of other people, that could possibly justify taxing the ownership of grand pianos. But I think that that's not an attractive way to go. It reminds me of the story. That's a separate issue. But it reminds me of the story of the farmer who was out in his fields plowing, plowed up a lamp, he rubbed the lamp, and the genie appeared. And the genie said to him, thank you for releasing me. I will give you whatever you ask for, and I will give your neighbor twice whatever I give you. What would you like me to give you? And the farmer thought and he said, genie, please give me blindness in one eye. We don't want to go down that route. I think that we should probably say that we're not so utilitarian as to want to allow people to be, allow the pain that people feel from envy to be part of our calculations.
Would it be efficient to tax the people who are whining?
If their whines bother us. So my second category I label land and other useful privilege. Now I've talked about privilege in a microphone moment. Privilege lets one person do what other people are not allowed to do. And I believe that land titles are privilege. With respect to other assets, you can say that assets belong to whoever made them. But in order to know who owns land, you have to have a land recording system. You have to be able to go down to the courthouse and find out who this privilege of exclusive access is assigned to. But we wouldn't want to do without land titles. It's important that the person who sows also be able to reap. It's important that land be used in such a way as that the person who has an opportunity to improve the land have access to land for the life of the improvement. And land titles give us that efficiency. But as Georgists know, it's possible to have all of that efficiency without requiring people to benefit disproportionately by private collection of the rent of land. The rent of land can be collected socially. This would apply to other natural opportunities for which exclusive access is efficient. Spectrum rights, fishing rights. There could be any number of things for which exclusive access is appropriate and it's efficient. Well, let's put it this way. There is no inefficiency associated with collecting all the value of exclusive access publicly. There's no reason in efficiency not to collect as much revenue as possible from land and other useful privilege. Shouldn't be a problem to explaining that here. When we talk about the possibility of collecting all the rent of land, one of the questions that comes up is what would that do to all the homeowners who have these huge mortgages? And I learned something about that from Michael Hudson. He gave me the idea that makes sense to me, and that is that when you have a mortgage, the mortgage is recorded at the courthouse. The recording of the mortgage specifies that the land can't be sold unless the mortgage is satisfied. That makes the mortgage holder the collector of the rent. And therefore, it seems to me, the appropriate person to send the rent bill to when we decide to collect the rent publicly. Whenever a mortgage exceeds the value of the improvements, that's collection of the rent by the mortgage holder. And if we're going to collect rent publicly, we should collect that portion of the rent from the mortgage holder and not from the title holder. So then we come to useless privilege. What I mean by useless privilege is, well, privilege is something that some people do what other people are not allowed to do. Crop allotments, import quotas, taxi medallions, anything, bank charters, anything that says, well, you have to get the government's permission to do something, and we'll give it to some people and not to others. That's one of the things that makes zoning particularly suspicious as well. So there is room for inefficiency and justice for the government to specify that activities that cause harm have to pay for the harm that they cause. But you can do that without privilege. You can just specify that whoever causes the harm has to pay the harm. Or if you have something like fishing rights, where you want only a limited number, you auction them off to the highest bidder or set a price where the market clears. And you do it without...
If that's a form of land value taxation. Natural resources.
Yeah, yes. So to the extent that we take the term land and say what it refers to as any natural opportunity It's just another form of land value taxation. So the
And the unnatural ones as well, like taxi cabs.
yeah, well, with respect to taxi cabs, the right thing to do is to eliminate the privilege. Now, if there is some negative externality associated with taxi cabs, then you require people to pay for the negative externality uniformly. And you manage the situation without privilege. So all useless privileges should be abolished. If there is any need for some regulation of them, or it's, rather than say some people can and other people can't, you want to say we use it as a source of revenue and charge people for the appropriate harm. Congestion charge, whatever, yes.
Don't the examples you mentioned, aren't they taxed because of the impact on natural monopolies adopted, administered by the government, such as roads? You don't want the roads to become choked with
Yeah.
zillions of
Yeah.
lifts and taxis and zoning because it allows for proper planning of infrastructure that is natural
Yeah.
monopoly.
Well, let's take those separately. With respect to congestion charging, you could call that a form of rent. I think that parking meter charges are rent, and you could say that if you want to be on the streets when there's a cost of being on the street, you're paying rent for being on the street. Yeah. Now, with respect to zoning, I don't think that's quite parallel. I think that to the extent that the use of a land causes harm to the value of surrounding property, that should be reflected in some charge on the person engaging in the activity. You might want to charge for shadows, charge for noise, charge for whatever it is that creates the harm.
And traffic impact fees.
Yes, there's no need to say some people can and some people can't. Anybody who wants to pay the price can do it. Yes.
Sorry, wouldn't the opposite occur, that the rent on the land that is in the shadow decrease? Wouldn't it just sort of naturally create a subsidy for people living in the shadows, so to speak?
Well, let's, in discussing this, suppose we're in a situation where all the rent is collected publicly.
That is what I.
Yeah, okay. So the person who's creating the shadow puts up his building until at a height or width, whatever, such that the marginal increment of size of the building just barely pays for itself. You'd be indifferent to being a little bit greater or smaller. But the marginal increment has a harm for the surrounding property that he doesn't take into account. What we want instead is for him to choose a different size of building where the profit from the additional size exactly offsets the cost in terms of lowering surrounding land value. Moving on, the next category is intellectual property. So looking at the chart, intellectual property doesn't have any value generated by nature. It's generated by a combination of ordinary labor and you might call it extraordinary labor, some combination of luck and particular skill. Gives you intellectual property. The other interesting thing about intellectual property is that almost universally, any restriction on or charge for access to intellectual property is inefficient. It costs nothing to provide an idea or a song or a book or an invention to one more person. The efficient price for access to intellectual property is zero. If we want to have efficiency with respect to intellectual property, we have to abolish intellectual property. But if we abolished intellectual property, people wouldn't have any incentive to create intellectual property. So how do we come out? Our tradition has been to grant a temporary monopoly, although in some cases monopoly is outrageously long.
Mouse.
Mickey Mouse, yes. I think that the right answer with respect to intellectual property is prizes. If we're going to collect all the rent of land, one of the worthwhile things to do with the rent of land is to award prizes to creators of intellectual property as an alternative to patents. Yes, Aaron.
Couldn't that potentially cause problems where the government might select and cherry pick certain projects that benefit whoever wants to like lobby for that kind of project?
Possibly. We have to think about it carefully. One economist who talked about prizes for innovations was Gordon Tullock. And Gordon Tullock proposed that be numerous governmental bodies who would decide independently what they wanted to support. I have thought in terms of some kind of a standard procedure. Like with respect to songs, you ask how often are they downloaded. With respect to books and similar things, how many copies have been sold, and at what prices, to try to estimate what the consumer surplus, what the net benefit, social benefit is, and take that into account when deciding what the payment should be, so that you don't have the arbitrariness of government officials. But that is something that needs to be concerned. Back there.
Oh, I was just gonna say exactly what you just said.
Okay.
We have the technology now to monitor distribution, and as long as we can monitor distribution, all content can be free, and we could also monitor sales of content on media.
Yes. Oh,
Sounds like a Soviet system. It's a work for the arts. And it has its benefits, and we still have the National Endowment for the Arts, and we could measure the popularity.
yeah.
How would you handle pharmaceuticals?
Similarly, we would have free access to all drugs, and we would make awards to people for creating new drugs. Yes?
As a way of supplementing the prizes, to me it seems like a good idea to ask the intellectual property holders to self-assess the value of that property.
No. Well, once we make it accessible to everybody, the value of all the property is zero.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that if they the prizes aren't going to go to everybody, probably. I mean.
Well, no, I would have prizes go to everybody.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So even if you wanted to do that, I'd say a good way of doing that would be to have a self-assessment, and then a market for it.
Well,
where there's a minor tax, and then on the annual value that could increase over time, and then if the public wanted to, they could go ahead and buy that
well,
directly.
let's talk about this afterward. I'm inclined to disagree with you, but let's have an exchange on this subject and see where we come out. But there's another question that interests me from an intellectual perspective, and that is conceptually, what should the size of the prize be? I would argue that we don't have, it wouldn't make sense to give every creator of every new thing the full social value of what he created. You wouldn't want to give Bill Gates $50 billion for coming up with Microsoft.
Because he already got 100.
Yeah, but if we were on the system, we wouldn't say to him, "This is a marvelous thing, this operating system. Here's $50 billion." We would find some smaller amount to give him. What is the theory of this? What the size of the prize ought to be?
Distribution.
And well, suppose we have all the distribution figures. No, perhaps.
How about tranches for different concepts?
Yeah, well, I have an idea that I'm about to give you. Let me give you my idea on the subject. I import thinking from another area of economics that I've tended to disdain in the past, and that is the theory of an optimal tax on wages. The economists who have worked on the theory of the optimal tax on wages have adopted a utilitarian perspective where they assume, for the purpose of analysis, that we have some sense of what the value of a dollar is to one person compared to the value of a dollar to somebody else. And then they make the kind of trade-off that economists customarily make, saying that if we tax people more, they're going to work less. But if we tax people more and they have above average incomes, we can take the extra taxes and spread them around to everybody, thereby increasing overall well-being. So I've never liked the idea of taxes on wages, but with respect to intellectual property, it seems to me that there's an argument for saying, well, we don't like the idea of giving these people monopolies. We want to give them something. And what we want to give them should represent some kind of a trade-off between the idea that if we give them more, they'll find more interesting stuff. But if we give them more, we have less money left in the rent fund to distribute to everybody else and to satisfy other social needs. So let's find the optimal trade-off. The more money an inventor already has, the less important it is, the less valuable it is to give him more money. The less money an inventor has to begin with, the more it might be worthwhile to give him some more money. Take the value of giving the inventor more money and trade it off against the fact that that money has other uses. That is the framework that it seems to me to make sense in thinking about the question of how big the prizes should be.
If
Yes.
the guy has a really dumb idea, though, he's going to do better than the guy with a good idea.
Elaborate.
You could come up with you could patent a really useless way to complete a certain task. Sorry. So, you could come.
Hold down the button. On the
Bottom.
It might not be on.
You could patent a really useless method to complete a task. You're not going to make very much money on that patent. Somebody with a better idea comes along, and he's going to make a lot more money on his patent. What you have proposed, the guy with the useless idea is going to be rewarded.
No, nobody will use his idea, so our estimate of the social value of the idea will be zero, so there'll be no reason to give him anything. So, yes.
Forgive a really stupid question. I'm trying to follow along. Who you say give him money? Who is giving the money?
Well, the government is
where's that money
giving,
coming from?
the money is coming from collecting the rent of land.
So it's the
There's
public.
the social fund, yeah, social treasury.
I just don't understand how that would work in practical terms.
Yeah. Well, we have governments that collect money and spend it on all kinds of things. I'm proposing that they collect the rent of land and spend it in part on providing prizes to people who come up with interesting new stuff.
Now, I'm sorry to continue. I have about to have a daughter-in-law who's a songwriter. She wants to write songs and
Yes,
make a living by selling them to artists.
right.
How does she make her living?
She writes songs, and we keep track of how often artists sing them and how often people download the songs that the artists sing, and we give her a check in the mail according to our estimate of the value of the songs, or an appropriate prize for associated with that value that's been created.
So there will be a bureaucracy associated with it.
Yes,
I see.
We already have bureaucracy for that.
yes.
For how long? How long have you
One time, well, as long as there is, well, okay. In the case of a songwriter, we see how much the song is used. At some point, we might decide we paid the songwriter enough. That's an adequate payment for that particular song. But
They
it,
really go on forever.
let me get a question over here. Yes.
I'm a retired lawyer and I dealt a little bit with intellectual property, enough to know it's sort of a necessary legal fiction. It really doesn't exist, but it's essential for creative workers in a money economy like The Woman's Daughter. So if Proudhon, the French philosopher,
Let's get to the question. This is not a
Yes.
comment session, it's a question.
isn't intellectual property, if property is theft, isn't it an intellectual theft of something that's imaginary?
I think that you came into the room after I started the discussion and you didn't hear what I said at the beginning. I think I answered your question at the beginning, so I'll continue the discussion with you later if you want. Well, so let me move on to the next category, which is mineral deposits. Now, comparing mineral deposits and intellectual property, you see that there are two things that are different. One is that mineral deposits include a contribution from nature, and mineral deposits are such that it's valuable to have exclusive access rather than free access. If there's a mineral, a silver deposit somewhere, you don't want to say anybody wants to come collect the silver. You want to assign it to somebody who is then going to mine it. So the silver deposit is a form of land, and it's appropriate to collect the rent of the silver deposit as efficiently as we can. And it's also appropriate because of this component of discovery that has something in common with intellectual property to have a finder's fee. And the same kind of analysis applies. You want to ask, what is the optimal finder's fee, taking account of the fact that if you pay more, you'll get people to find more stuff, but it'll take more in the way of government resources if you pay more. Yes?
You said you would assign a corporate, some kind of industry to collect the silver, but isn't that free for all, that anyone could be,
Yeah,
what may be
well, anyone can bid. Anyone can bid, and we give it to the highest bidder. Well, one bit of economic detail that you might be interested in is economists would generally say, you let everybody bid, you give it to the highest bidder, and require the highest bidder to pay the second highest bid. The second highest bid represents what he's depriving the society of by having it for himself. It's what it's worth to somebody else. So that second price auction also motivates people to report truthfully how much it's worth to them. So it's a somewhat more efficient auction process.
Who bids for those who are not present at the auction, future generations, for mineral deposits? Who will be assigned to represent them?
They are represented in a different way. They're represented when we ask the question of what do we do with the rent that we collect from the person who mines the deposit. If we allocate that rent in such a way that the incomes of future generations are lower than our own incomes, then we have allocated it unjustly. We need to allocate it in such a way that we don't get into a path of declining incomes. And then the last category is natural monopolies. I had occasion to think carefully about what a natural monopoly is for this inquiry. And it seemed to me that one economically interesting way to define a natural monopoly is to say that a natural monopoly is something with a component of natural monopoly is what you have when you invest some money in something, and then what you have is worth more than your investment.
A QWERTY keyboard.
What do you have in mind there?
Well, presumably sometime in the 19th century, somebody designed the optimal keyboard layout for typewriters.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it stuck to the
Yeah.
point where now
Well,
that becomes the premium
Standard.
Yeah.
value.
Yeah, well, but a QWERTY keyboard only costs its cost of production. I'm thinking of something more like Facebook, where you might put in $100 million and you have something that's worth $100 billion. If we all decide we want to be on the same social network, whoever has a social network has a kind of a natural monopoly. Same for the operating system. I wouldn't necessarily call Google a natural monopoly. I think that Google has their dominant position because they have the best search engine. Anybody who wants to can use Bing or Yahoo or any other search engine. There's no need for us all to use the same search engine. But Google got it right, and the others just aren't as good. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I mean, maybe I'm slow to understand this, but it seems to me the point you're just making does, in my mind, violence to the meaning of the word monopoly. I mean, I think of monopoly as something that we're inherently, there's an aspect of keeping everybody else from using it. So maybe I'm just not following, but
Okay.
in the case of Facebook, you're talking about something that's a smash hit. If there are monopolistic tendencies, as Bill Gates has and Steve Jobs, then you may have both elements of successful business and
Yeah.
monopoly. So I'm just not following
Okay,
that
well,
aspect.
what economists generally mean by monopoly is from the Greek root a single seller. Now, the word monopoly has undergone a lot of interesting evolution over the course of the English language. If you look at how the word monopoly was used in 1700, it meant somebody who was charging too much. The idea of connection to a single seller had sort of drifted away. But then when economic analysis started in earnest in the 19th century, the word among economists went back to its Greek roots of being a single seller.
I think you can only charge too much if you somehow prevent people from having another alternative.
Yeah. Well, what economists would say is that if there is no element of monopoly, then when you invest, you'll only get an ordinary return. When you see people get something more than an ordinary return, you have to ask what's the explanation. And one possible explanation is that it's efficient to have only one seller. And whoever gets there first is going to have the whole market. It just doesn't pay for anybody else to enter the market after one person has established his position.
But I mean, I think in many market doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Somebody
Well,
gets in, other people want to get in.
I would suggest that the reason I'm on Facebook is not because I decided Facebook was the best platform. The reason I'm on Facebook is because everybody I want to interact with is on Facebook. And once that happens, you have a socially created monopoly rather than a government created monopoly. Nobody has granted Facebook a monopoly on that thing, but you know, it's like VHS tape was inferior to beta tape back when we were doing tape, but everybody bought VSH tape because all the people putting out things you would want to buy put it out on VHS, and the people put it out on VHS because everybody had a VHS player. So it's a reinforcing loop that is socially created rather than government created, but it causes inferior products to dominate the market because the superior product has to overcome that network effect, that network advantage that the inferior product has.
Yeah, but is it economic?
Well, so let me get John Beck's comment here.
Okay, I just had a question. Usually I think a natural monopoly as being situations where there's a large fixed cost and low marginal cost.
Right.
Is that a specific case of your definition?
Yes.
Is that identical to your definition?
That's
or
one
your
example.
definition is- Your definition's
okay.
broader.
So I'm going. You're right that economists generally think of that as what they mean by a natural monopoly, but I'm using a different aspect of economic thinking, you might say. The monopolist is a single seller, and you can have a single seller because of declining average costs, or you could have a single seller because of network effects. And so I'm saying that if you have a situation where after investment you have something that's worth more than you invested in, and that's a persistent situation, there's something that causes that that's of questionable moral worth. And so it seems to me that people who are concerned about inequality in wealth these days are concerned substantially about internet successes where a little bit of money was invested, and after a small investment, they have something that's worth a lot of money because they got there first. And it seems to me that getting there first with respect to the possibility of being the only one in the market analytically has something in common with getting there first to the silver deposit. And therefore, it seems to me that it's interesting to consider this possibility that I never would have thought of thinking about before a year or 6 months ago or so, of saying that when somebody has something that's worth more than what was invested in it, we'll call that equivalent to intellectual property or a natural mineral deposit, and say we'll give you a finder's fee, we'll optimize the finder's fee, and then tax the excess value like land value. That's my radical idea for today. Bill.